Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today I have kind of an interesting video for you because I don't do that many recommendation videos, but I thought today I would recommend some adult, adult. I do read books that are written for adults, not just middle grade or YA books. I do read adult books sometimes, and I thought I would recommend some books for adults who love horror, and especially books that are in the Christian genre of horror, which is a very interesting subset. I was recently having a conversation with one of you, the Green Goblinator, and we were talking about the use of Christianity and like horror symbols in horror fiction. And it really inspired me to think about what are some of the Christian horror novels I've read that I would love to recommend to all of you. Now, Christian horror novels is a very interesting subgenre of Christian fiction. Nowadays, not that popular. However, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there were quite a few authors writing Christian fiction that was distinctly horror. And a lot of it had to do with demonology, with Satan, with all kinds of things. A lot of them talked about near-death experiences, and I found all of these fascinating. Now, I actually own more books that I'm actually going to show you today, but I wanted to show you ones that I have read so I can confidently tell you these are worth reading and very interesting. So I think it's good to go back to the beginning, to the one who probably started the idea of more modern Christian horror, because let's be real, probably Dante's Inferno is really the real old-time inspiration for Christian horror and using kind of horrific imagery to tell a story that's specifically in a Christian worldview. Now, I will freely admit Dante and I have a lot of different opinions about a lot of things, but I do think he started the genre. And who else picked up on that genre? Why, none other than the one and only C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, or Clive Staples Lewis, he wrote a lot of things, including The Chronicles of Narnia and a book called Mere Christianity, which is probably between Mere Christianity and Narnia. Those are his probably two most famous works. But another very interesting work is the Screwtape Letters. Now, I actually recently just read this whole thing all the way through for the first time, and I will say it was a disturbing experience. This book is about an elder demon writing to a younger demon who is tempting a human being and trying to get him to do evil. And this elder demon is writing these letters to this younger demon, kind of giving a lot of different philosophical thoughts. It's a very dense book, and it's definitely fiction because there's a lot of things that are so bonkers that happen in this book that kind of made me go, wait, what? Like, what is happening in this book? But this book really set the stage for a lot of other horror fiction in the Christian genre that was to come. And so the Screwtape Letters is pretty scary, I gotta say. I do not think it's one to read just kind of lightly. I think it's something to go into ready to feel like you're gonna get a little scared and maybe a little disturbed. That is the Screwtape Letters. But there's another C.S. Lewis book that I'm pretty sure not a lot of people have read that I actually think is maybe even scarier than the Screwtape Letters. And that is The Dark Tower and Other Stories. Now, this book, this one is a real creepy one that has a lot of different short stories in it. And the first short story is actually kind of an extended novella that was unfinished that is based off of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. Now, the Space Trilogy is itself a whole experience that I will talk about someday because that is a wild book to read. But this book, The Dark Tower and Other Stories, the Dark Tower story is based on the Space Trilogy, and it is weird and really creepy. It has some really disturbing, just quiet, creepy dread moments and a really horrific scene that comes out of nowhere, leads into this wild action sequence, and then the novella just ends. So I will tell you, there's no conclusion to this short story. It just ends because C.S. Lewis abandoned the project, which I think is really interesting. However, there are some other short stories in this book that are so creepy. One in particular is a short story called Forms of Things Unknown, and it is so terrifying. It is such a great, short, creepy story. It actually has a sci-fi bent to it, and I loved it. I remember reading it late at night, and I was reading along, just kind of thinking like, oh, what's going to happen in this story? And then the ending happens, and you're just sitting there like, okay, I need to go turn on some lights now. That's C.S. Lewis for you. There's also one very beautiful story at the very end of this book that's another unfinished novel called After 10 Years that is about Helen of Troy that's also super fascinating. This book is equally frustrating and fascinating because there's a lot of interesting ideas and some abandoned ideas that we never get to see. What else would C.S. Lewis have done with that? So C.S. Lewis really started to pave this way for the horror writers who would come next. And speaking of people who are actually called the Christian Stephen King, that would be none other than Frank E. Peretti. This is a bind-up edition that I have had for years of two novels, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness by Frank Peretti. Now, these two books jump-started the spiritual warfare genre of Christian horror fiction, which is spiritual warfare in Christianity is this idea of Christians taking on demons and Satan and praying against demons, praying against Satan, asking Jesus to, send angels to fight against those demons. And that is what these books are all about. These books have a lot of demon possession in them, deliverance from demons, all kinds of things. And I will say they're a little more of a mystery in some ways with supernatural horror as part of what's going on, as well as a lot of other random topics, which someday I will get into this book because this book is fascinating for a lot of reasons. But what's most interesting about this book is This Present Darkness was actually not selling very well and was kind of on shelves from Crossway Publishers. And then a singer named Amy Grant got a hold of it. Yes, that Amy Grant who does Christmas albums and sings Baby Baby and all those songs. She got a hold of This Present Darkness, read it, and started promoting it at her concerts, telling people about it. And so people started buying this book so fast. The publishers couldn't get enough out to the bookstores. It was on back order forever. People loved it and ate it up. And that led to Frank Peretti becoming a huge name in Christian fiction, and especially Christian horror fiction, which he definitely is, kind of like the Stephen King of Christian horror. One of Frank Peretti's other horror novels that he wrote was called The Oath. Now, I wish I had the hardback original edition of this book because it's such a great cover. This one is a paperback edition that's a little bit newer, but it's still a really fascinating, creepy horror story about a small town that is overrun by something. And I cannot tell you what that is because it is just, this book is meant to be like explored, examined, and discovered. And I think that The Oath is such a creepy story. Frank Peretti is so good at writing about horror in a small town and talking about it if within the realm of Christianity. So he does a really good job in tackling huge subject matter. This one is not as much a spiritual warfare story as something else that's going on in this book that is very Stephen King, in my opinion. I think this book is the most Stephen King of all the Frank Peretti books, but The Oath is definitely worth a read. It is terrifying. It's so suspenseful. It will definitely keep you up at night wondering what is happening. Frank Peretti is a very cinematic writer, so you're kind of like flipping pages so fast because you just want to know what is going on. Now, somewhere along the way, I lost my dust jacket for this Frank Peretti book, but this book is called Monster. Is that upside down? There we go. This book is called Monster by Frank Peretti, and this one is Frank Peretti's take on Bigfoot. It is a Bigfoot horror novel that is a Christian Bigfoot horror novel, and if that doesn't sound wild enough, it is. This book has an opening sequence where these two campers are in this tent camping way out in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. And it is so terrifying what happens in the middle of the night. I loved it so much. It definitely gave me goosebumps. I definitely could not read without the lights on. It was so good. Monster is definitely a creature feature sort of story, and it's so fun. There are some very interesting conversations as well about like evolution and all of those sorts of things about, the world and like, can things like a Bigfoot actually exist and be out there somewhere? And Frank Peretti tackles those topics in an interesting way. Moving on to one of my favorite authors. I actually haven't talked about him a lot because sadly, he doesn't really write books anymore. I wish he still wrote more books. But that is Robert Liparulo, and this book is the first book that he wrote called Comes a Horseman. And this book is so creepy, so terrifying. It is about this guy who is investigating near-death experiences and has a near-death experience and the horrific things that start to take place after that near-death experience. There's also a really interesting subplot with the FBI in this book. So there's like this procedural kind of thing going on as well, which I think adds layers to this in a very interesting way. I really enjoyed this book. I read it so fast, I could not stop reading. It definitely is scary, has a lot of fun moments in it, but Comes a Horseman, definitely worth a read. And then to another author who actually doesn't write horror that much, but when he writes horror, it is so good. And that is Travis Thrasher. Isolation is such a terrifying book. This book is set in North Carolina, where this family's moving into this house that I believe they inherited it. And I will just tell you, one of the opening chapters has a scene of meat falling from the sky. And it was absolutely so horrific. It was terrifying. There's a lot of really scary stuff that happens in this book. There's all kinds of things at this house that they discover about the house that definitely leads them on a journey. This family that is just trying to survive and get out of this place alive because they're very isolated where this house is. And it is so fun. This is definitely a kind of a one and done sort of story that you jump in, read it. It's not super long compared to some of the other ones on this list, but this one is really great. I definitely enjoyed Isolation. Travis Thrasher, he's a little less heavy-handed with Christianity, so he doesn't have as much he's not like, here's Bible verses and here's a whole sermon on this topic. He's more, this is in the realm of Christianity, like Christianity exists in this world and this story exists in that world. Unfortunately, Travis Thrasher, like I said, doesn't really write a lot of horror. He has a YA horror series that is so good called The Solitary Tales that I actually got to interview Travis Thrasher once, and I asked him, I said, is Isolation related to The Solitary Tales? Like, are these in the same world? I want them to be in the same universe. And he kind of was like, wink, wink. I don't know. And he would never say. So and secretly in my brain, it's all connected, but it's really isolated, hence the name Isolation. And then I want to share with you 3 books from another author who's so great. He hasn't written a lot in a little while. Like I said, the Christian horror genre is kind of ripe, I think, for new work. But there's just not a lot being published in this realm anymore that's Christian horror by any of the big Christian publishers, which I do think is interesting. A lot of Christian publishers right now are publishing romance, they're publishing dramas, they're publishing like FBI procedural books or suspense thrillers that are more not exactly like a thriller in the sense of horror, but more the thriller in the sense of like a serial killer sort of things. But even that, it's a little more light than it is like a more horrific take on a serial killer, like another author we're going to get to here in a minute does. But this author, T.L. Hines, writes some super creative books that I loved. I've read 3 of his books and I've loved every single one of them. And the first one I read was called The Dead Whisper On by T.L. Hines. Now, this cover is so creepy, and that image right there is reflected in this story. This is about a lady named Candace who she used to be a miner, and so she would go into the mines and she would be like kind of like looking for new areas of the mine to explore, that kind of a thing. And then her father dies, and so she moves back to her hometown, and she's just kind of like living day to day as a garbage truck driver. And then the dead start talking to her, and she is hearing these voices that are telling her all these things. They have a mission for her to do, and they need her to do something. And it goes from there. It has a wild ending that I remember thinking, like, what is happening right now? This is so out there, but so much fun. I really, really enjoyed the ending of this one, and it was just a ton of fun. I think it has a lot to say about death. It talks a lot about like grief and like how do you move through grief? How do you move past like the death, especially of a loved one? And I think that this book really answers a lot of those questions in a really well-packaged supernatural horror story that will really leave you on the edge of your seat, like plowing through this book to get to the end. The next one from T.L. Hines I want to talk about is a book that is super interesting called The Unseen. Now, this is a horror book about urban exploration. So if you have seen like, the back rooms and all those kinds of things, this is like a Christian horror novel about the back rooms, where there's this guy that loves to do urban exploration. He knows how to get into all these places no one else knows how to get to. And then someone finds him, someone who knows if it's a someone or a something, and that someone or something wants him to do a task for them. And so he has to do it, or he may never survive again. And I think this is a really interesting book. It is super creepy, super disturbing. If you are ever in a business like building ever again after reading this book, you will always be looking at the acoustic ceiling tile and wondering, is someone watching me right now? I don't know. They could be. They could be the unseen. This was a really fun book. Super, super interesting. It was a little longer than some of T.L. Hines' other books, but I was here for it. Every minute of it never felt like a drag. Super fun, super scary read. And then this next one, I actually didn't read the physical book. I actually listened to it on audiobook with my wife on a road trip, and we loved this book. We couldn't wait to actually get back in the car to keep listening to the next part of the story because it was really fascinating. And that is called The Falling Away by T.L. Hines. I will also just throw in here, the audio narrator for this book was excellent. Did such a good job narrating this book, keeping it super creepy, super interesting, and we loved it. This one is about a guy named Dylan Runs Ahead, and he is part of a tribe from Montana who is running away from his life. And he gets involved in a mystery searching for his lost sister. And he's trying to figure out what has happened to her. So he goes to these small towns, he's trying to piece this together, and he discovers that there is something horrific happening between these small towns. And it's up to him to figure out what it is and what has actually happened to his sister. There is a scene later on with one of the creepiest characters I think I've ever read about in a book that was so disturbing. My wife and I were definitely like, okay, that was pretty creepy. Don't like that very much. But it was so fun. This book definitely will keep you on the edge of your seat. I think it's really interesting too. T.L. Hines is from Montana, so he has a lot to say about Montana and kind of exploring that area of the United States, which I think is interesting. I haven't read a ton of books set in those sorts of settings, like in Montana in the north of the United States there. So this was definitely an interesting read, well-researched, and a lot of fun. And then to the author who took up the mantle of Frank Peretti and created some of my favorite of all time book universes. And that is an author that I've really enjoyed his work so many times. I will say some of his newer books are not as good because he is doing them with a different publisher. And I do think sometimes for some authors, there is a special magic that happens when this particular author gets paired with this particular editor. And this author got paired with a great editor who just knocked every book out of the park, I think, and really helped elevate these stories into something truly special and really never repeated since in the Christian horror market. Like these books, there's nothing else like them, even since and even today. So let's dive into 4 of these, because some of this author's other works are more fantasy than horror and more suspense than horror, but these 4 are pretty in the horror camp, in my opinion. The first one is one of my favorite books by this author called Adam. And Adam by Ted Dekker is such a good book. This will leave you on the edge of your seat. It is about an FBI agent who is trying to solve a murder, and along the way, there's like near-death experience stuff that happens. There is some super creepy stuff that goes on with some dream sequences that are absolutely terrifying. I had to go turn on the lights after I was reading it. I like to read these books at night, and I do this to myself because I'll be reading it with my little book light with the lights off, and then I'm like, I gotta go turn on the lamp. I can't keep reading without the lamp on because it's too creepy. So this one was so much fun. I so enjoyed it. It is worth the read. Now, this edition that I have is the special Christian retail edition, and I don't actually know what the difference between it and the regular edition is. So Adam, it comes in a couple of different editions, and this one in particular, I do know had some extra chapters in it that were definitely from a Christian point of view, and had some sequences that I thought, oh wow, that's very fascinating. Some very interesting explorations of who Christ is and what Jesus did on the cross in particular. And there's a lot of exploration as well of demonology, which is pretty creepy stuff. And so this one was a great read. The other thing that's fascinating about this one is that interspersed between the chapters were these articles. And they had like these newspaper articles that felt like real articles from newspapers with like clippings and things and like kind of artwork and things like pictures and stuff that just made this book that much creepier. The next book by Ted Dekker I want to talk about is a book called Skin. Now, I can't really talk a ton about this book. This book, do not look it up. In my opinion, don't read anything about this book before going into it. I think it's better to go in cold and just start reading it, because there is a major twist that just blew my mind when I read it. I kept thinking, wow, I never ever would have pieced that together. It was so fascinating and so terrifying. In this book, these characters get trapped in this small town that's like abandoned, and they're the only people there, and there is like basically like sandstorms all around the town, so they can't get out, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. There's this mysterious person or thing that keeps appearing in town that they're trying to chase down, who is also seeming to chase them down, that they're trying to get away from. And it is just absolutely terrifying. It was so good. Like I said, this book has such a great twist ending that I absolutely loved. And I don't want to say anything else about this book because it was that much fun. Definitely worth a read. And then if you're ready to get your vampire on in the Christian horror realm, and yes, I don't even know how he did it, but somehow Ted Dekker wrote a vampire novel that is definitely a Christian horror novel. And that book is called Emmanuel's Veins. Now, what is so interesting to me is this little silver sticker that they put on this edition and put out in the Christian markets. And the little silver sticker says, "See the first pages for how this book is changing lives." And I think they wanted to put that sticker on the front of this cover because some readers might look at this and be like, is this a vampire novel? Like, why are you writing a vampire novel? And so I think the publisher was trying to say, you know what? We're going to try and get around all of any sort of controversy that might happen because we believe in this book, and it's a really good book too. So we want to put on there this sticker about like these stories of people's lives being changed by reading this book. This book was so great. It is gothic horror to the maximum. It takes place in this like gothic castle. There is everything you could want in this book in a vampire type novel. It is super creepy. It's super intense. You have just these great like lavish set pieces, which Ted Dekker did such a good job in this book, I think, setting the scenery all around the storyline, which is absolutely creepy. Now, I will say, this book is almost a little better read if you have read some of Ted Dekker's other books, including his Circle series, which starts with the book Black, then Red, then White, and then you can read Green, but it's not worth it in my opinion. So Black, Red, and White, if you read those, it will inform this book in a way that makes you just elevate it that much more. Ted Dekker's books are often interconnected in very small ways, and when you read those things, it's fascinating. So this one, super good, super creepy. It has that gothic horror vibe. If you're into vampires, gothic horror, that kind of stuff, and you're curious how a Christian horror novel about vampires goes, this is your book. And then the last book I want to talk about is actually a combination of two authors on this list already. Frank Peretti and Ted Dekker actually teamed up to write a book, and that book was called House. Now, I gotta say, this book is not the strongest book on this list, and it's a little bit of a wild book. Like in the middle of it, it's kind of run around in a lot of ways where they're just kind of, the characters like running around to the same places, it felt like a little bit over and over, but then it has a really good ending. It has a great beginning, has a really good setup, a really interesting set of characters. It's just the middle section's a little convoluted, but if you can get past that, it's pretty interesting book. Frank Peretti and Ted Dekker, one of them wrote the beginning half and one of them wrote the last half, and then they switched halves and kind of edited the other person's half. And I actually think you can kind of tell that happened, but it sort of works out okay story-wise, because you can see where Ted Dekker, if you've read any other Ted Dekker books, you can see where Ted Dekker is bringing in some stuff, and you can also see where Frank Peretti's coming in with some Frank Peretti-isms. So it's kind of an interesting thing if you've read both of the authors before to see like how are they working together. They actually both don't ever work together again. Frank Peretti especially has barely ever co-written a book. And I would not be surprised if this was a push from the publisher to be like, hey, wouldn't this be such an awesome thing if we got Frank Peretti and Ted Dekker to write a book together? And so it kind of is a little corporate-y, gimmicky a little bit, but it's still really fun. And it's still a good horror story, in my opinion. It's a good haunted house type story that's a Christian horror story. So those are a few recommendations. If you're interested in the world of Christian horror, there is stuff out there and it's interesting. It's definitely different than other kinds of horror. I will say most of these books have very hopeful notes, but that is not to say they don't deal with some sad stuff. They don't have moments of deep despair, and there's definitely a lot of really intense dark stuff in some of these books. So it definitely is something where they're exploring this world of horror from a Christian perspective, which I find fascinating. As a Christian myself, I think it's very interesting to see how would someone explore this and like talk about some of these sorts of things that scare us. Like, how do we talk about the things that scare us from a Christian point of view? And I think that's really interesting. So until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye.